Hi everyone, welcome to Type Talks. Today we have Dario Nardi with us, the brain scientist, the neuroscientist, and the also highly spiritual human being. Dario has a lot of contributions to the type field. He will also be speaking at the November conference for the Association of Psychological Type International, and so I'll have that link below if you're interested. But yes, how would you like to introduce yourself to people who are new to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm just going to make sure here I remember to also recommend people to attend the British type conference that is coming up as well, as the Australian type conference. So that's the Australian type conference is their annual conference that happens every October. That will be like a big thing, and people can attend online, and it will be in English, Australian English. And then the British one is just like a short panel that's coming up. So yeah, anyway, I tend to say, hi, I'm Dario. I've been working with type. I was certified in Myers-Briggs Type Indicator with CPP, now the Myers-Briggs company, in 1994 through Linda Behrens, who is trained as a marriage and family therapist, although she has been doing organizational psych and working with typology in a variety of ways for many years. So I learned a lot from her and from the type community, the professional type community, beginning in the mid-90s, really before the World Wide Web existed. I mean, in any tangible form, meaningful form. I don't know, is the World Wide Web ever tangible? So that's like a quick background on it. I come sort of with several different perspectives. A type 1 is a systems perspective. So that's that human beings are organic living systems, which means that usually biological metaphors of living things are the most appropriate metaphors to understand type. That means, for example, a cake is not a good metaphor to understand type. Lock and a key, probably not a good metaphor. They have their uses. The other thing, what that means in practice, one, everything is connected to everything else, although some more than others. And that, Jung actually saw people and the practice that way too. And I say practice because he was a therapist and he saw patients. He had a clinical practice, and he didn't have formal definitions. Peter Geyer from the Australian type community, who is a longtime sort of type historian, proposes. He says that type really, way we could view it as like a mandala. That the 8 functions are like a mandala, and that it's something that we would come and we would meditate on repeatedly. So trying to reduce the functions into these very specific definitions or whatever, when we do that, we actually just reduce them to a particular person and time and place, which doesn't mean that they're wrong at all, but that's not the whole story. There's never the whole story, which is probably the big attraction to it. So that's a big part of it. I believe very much in the best fit self-discovery process and the ethics of type. So not no like test and tell, here's the test and it will tell you what type you are, or here are the gurus and they will tell you what type you are no matter how much you pay them. So it's really, there's a process to go through. And what I subscribe to in the process is triangulation, which not the political meaning of that, but the outdoors, you're lost in the woods. How do you find your way? Meaning of it, and we can talk about that if we want. So I've been involved with type for a long time, and very lucky to start with Linda, understanding, for example, that we can learn about the types not just by sitting down and brainstorming and talking, although that's great, but interviewing people, for example, and doing structured interviews, and then finding the themes that they have in common, and then finding the ways to express type in people's own language. Having fairness, because there's been a bias against people with sensing preference. And notice I didn't say sensing types. I said people with the sensing preference because we use all of the functions, just like I have two hands. I have my intuiting hand, and then I have my sensing hand. There's that nature metaphor there. And so that's a big part of what I do. And then in 2006, I started doing brain imaging. And at first I didn't really see a lot, and I did it mostly for fun. And I just wanted to see, first of all, like basically, how does the technology work and how is the brain actually organized? And it's one thing to read things in a textbook or a popular article or some research paper. It's another really to get, say, as I did 5 years of just every quarter at UCLA, having students come into the lab and doing self-exploration and seeing, how yes, the brain is organized in a network, and it also has functional regions. And the limitations of the technology, how we can analyze it. But it turns out, yes, that it's not a surprise. The Minnesota twins study done years ago on genetically identical twins raised separately showed the contribution of genetics to the MBTI dimensions, as well as 5-factor dimensions and some others, was all 40 to 60%. And so it's not a surprise when we look at the brain, it's not 100% type. And it's certainly not, here's like, I don't know, like intuiting, feeling, thinking, sensing, something like that. Like, that's not how it works. But we use the parts of our brain, which means we develop them or we reinforce them. Those all sort of mean the same thing. That meet our practical needs, like getting through the American school system if you're American, getting through life in general, so meeting our practical needs as well as meeting our psychological needs, because like everybody pretty much needs to go through a school system. The question though is that's not all of it. We also have psychological needs, and so how do we meet those? And then the brain reflects that, and the brain gives this imaging, gives this picture of the developed self. And then that leads to sort of where I've been the past 5 years, really, really looking back again at Jung. And I have to thank Steve Myers in the UK for sort of pointing me in the right direction there, that Jung was about one-sidedness, not about type. And he saw a type as simply as Linda Barron says, like a lens and the language and a lever in a clinical practice to work with people to free them from excessive one-sidedness. And I say excessive because we can talk about preference, like hand preference, but I still use both hands. We can talk about bias, which is something that's usually conscious and identifiable, or can at least be brought to our attention. And then we can do something about it. And then there's like deep one-sidedness, which is usually unconscious to us. And then that gets into the unconscious and all of that. So just looking and trying to put type within this larger picture of sort of body-mind practices, and how can we understand where we are, who we are. Jung said he was not a mystic, that he simply took psychology, the task of psychology, extremely seriously. Like really seriously, like how do we understand psyche, which is not the same as brain or mind. Psyche is more about consciousness. So along the way, yeah, I've made a few contributions, and it's sort of a surprise. I didn't think I would be so involved with type, certainly when I was 15 or 20. I didn't even know it existed, but I'm very happy to be here today. And I know this seems like a long introduction, but I don't think I've actually ever expressed sort of the journey and what it looks like. So, yeah. So thank you for that opportunity.
Of course, yes. Linda Behrens is great. A lot of people in the newer type communities don't know about her, so I'll also have her linked below. She has a lot of interesting resources on the essential motivators, which is also known as temperament theory by Kiersey, but she expands on his work. There's also interaction styles that she brings to the table too. And now she has intentional drivers, which is basically dividing the types into their cognitive function groupings and understanding them in that sort of way. And so, yeah, there are a lot of type teachers out there that people aren't as aware of just because they're not as prevalent on YouTube, but they're very prevalent in the other spaces. So I would highly recommend you look out for those figures there. And so Dario also mentions the other branches of the APT. And so with the Australian Association of Psychological Type, I'll actually be speaking at their upcoming conference. So feel free to check that out too. I'll provide a link to that as well. I'm providing a lot of links today. And Dario also talks about the test and tell. And so it's important for people to keep in mind that a test or a person, a one data point cannot tell you your holistic type, most likely. It requires a process of triangulation. So really looking at the multiple different sources. And from that, you take a holistic systems view of who you are from it. And then you can figure out from there what you seem to resonate the most with. Don't look to a single authority, whether it's a test or a paid professional, even tell you who you are. It could be helpful on your journey to get another perspective, but it's not a defining endpoint to your journey. It's more of the point where you open yourself up to more discussion and more self-inquiry and self-discovery. And so you have these really interesting concepts that you bring to the table. And I actually have interviewed Dario in the past about some of them too, so I'll put those in the description box. But another one that you talk about as well is analytic and holistic. And so I'm wondering if you could describe that to people who are new to this concept that you bring.
Sure. So one thing that sort of struck me along the way a few years ago is that I had some interns, and UCLA interns who always have been delightful, hardworking, very bright students. And one of them, we really needed to start tackling like each individual type. When you end up with 30, 40, 50, 60 people of the same type, then there's like definitely room to start analyzing what are the differences and similarities within type. And she took all of the ENFP data, specifically the brain wiring data. So there's like different kinds of data. And for those of you who've seen my 2011 book, I don't talk about brain wiring in that, but that's mostly my focus today. And so she took all of that data, and she created sort of a composite picture of the average ENFP. And then we have demographic data. So all the people over the years, they indicate like their educational upbringing and cultural upbringing, identify male or female, all of these different factors, like what did they work in, what was their major, how old are they, their ethnicity, the variety of things. And she started to sort it in different ways. And regardless of, well, I'll just mention two. So she sorted them into male and female. And then she also sorted them into 4 different career areas. But then we went down from 4 to 2 because of the 4, like you could clearly see there were things in common, like 2 and 2. And the career one in particular stood out. And it was almost like there's 2 different kinds of ENFPs. And one, it's not that they were completely different, because the brain wiring shows like the strongest link and then the secondary, and then presumably there's other weaker links, but they aren't shown. And so what was strong for one sort of demographic group, one career area, was in the background, was secondary for the other. And then then it was reversed for the other one. So it's almost like background and foreground. That all ENFPs have these pool of strengths and ways of operating, but for some of them there are certain ones that come to the foreground or go into the background because of their career. And if you think about it, I mean, we would expect career to have a huge impact, because if somebody is not 18 or 22 like my original college student set of data subjects, but they're like 30, 40, 50, 62, like whatever, 80, all different career areas, and people are repeating this stuff like 5 days a week for years. And that should affect your brain. If it didn't affect the brain, I would be really surprised. And so we saw that, yeah, those people who were in more analytic professions that required more analytical skills, so math, science, technology, engineering, law, finance, also some things which maybe aren't as analytical mentally, but still work by rules and regulations. So they could be a little bit more blue collar things, or the military, something like that. Which actually in the military you deal with a lot of technology. So there was this one style, and yes, by the way, there are many ENFPs who have analytic style, who have some kind of analytic background. Not all of them are, like, I don't know, film producers or something like that, or therapists. And then there's this other group, which is social services, humanities, the arts, more holistic, um, a group of people, and they had a different pattern. And then as I got into looking over the, thank you, COVID, to really push me to go through all of the data, like now over 500 people. And thank you, Joe Arrigo, by the way, also for like strongly encouraging me to get to it. That I just saw this pattern again and again. And then we can group people like the ENFPs and the ENTPs together, and we're going to see commonalities, and they both have the same dominant function, and so on. So what we really end up with is we end up with another lens, analytic holistic. And the way I would describe it to the average person is either in terms of career stuff, like STEM, business, military, that kind of thing, that's analytic, or holistic is going to be the arts, social services, humanities. There's those two, but we can also use some other terms, like when for the French type association, they're like, we don't want to use so much analytic holistic. Like, we want to communicate to our members better. How can we do that? And I said, well, what about yin and yang, or yang, is how it is, yin and yang. And they're like, no, that's fantastic. Like, let's use that. So I don't mean to appropriate those sort of religious terms, spiritual terms, but they do fit very well, actually. And Jung talks so much about things like anima, animus, and eros and logos, that there is this like two sides of the same coin. So when we look at each function, like extroverted sensing, or introverted feeling, or whatever it is, that and why is it that some person comes along and they're like, oh, extroverted sensing is very aggressive and very physical, and it's like Donald Trump, and it's this and that. And then some other person comes along and they're like, well, I'm an ESFP, like I don't relate to that at all. I don't experience my function that way. And people are like, well, you're an ESFP, so maybe that's it. But I don't think that's the case, because you can take people of the same type and you can get, for example, INTJs, or whatever type, as much more like structured, rule-based, conventional, dominant, aggressive, analytical. There's that word. Or you can get ones that are much more, I don't want to say touchy-feely, but that's part of it, creative, exploratory, sort of chill many times. Maybe that really can even help us with some problems. And I say problems, challenges, like best fit type. Person wonders, am I INFJ or INTJ? They're thinking. Or they may be thinking, am I, even something that might seem quite different, like ENTP and ESFP. And I think that by sorting, like looking at the 8 functions and saying, whoa, then this really opens up this door to understanding how rich each function is. And I think that people may be surprised sometimes that their dominant may be, their auxiliary may be, certainly other functions, non-preferred ones, are probably going to be sort of one-sided in their use. They're going to have like a very yin approach to a certain function. And like for me, for example, with introverted thinking, I very much can relate to and work with people who have sort of a yin holistic introverted thinking. If it's the analytic version, like forget it. I'm not going to say, like, I'm not standing there being like, oh no, like I decided this person has this version, I'm not going to work with him. But I just know from experience, it's like, oh, that's why I find those folks really difficult. And this is a non-preferred function for me, so I'm like struggling as it is, versus the ones who use holistic. So I think we can use it in a lot of different ways.
I like the nuance that this kind of way of thinking brings because it allows you to see that there's a spectrum within a function, in that your circumstance can actually impact how you show up as well. And it's almost like what came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, did you go into an artsy field because you're more holistic, or did you turn more holistic because you went into an arts field? Who knows? That's a question for another time. But your research brings up really interesting findings because it allows for a more diverse expression of a function. And I think that is a great contribution to the field. And so I'm wondering about how analytic and holistic show up in all of the functions. So could you let us know a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, without going into too much, there is a handout, and it's a kind of handout that's free for people. So if you also want to include that, or include a link for people to just download it for free, that's fine. It's like a one pager. Um, so to give some examples, um, I'll start with, well, I mean, I'll start with myself actually, and that's introverted intuiting. So there's an analytic version of introverted intuiting that I can relate to right away. And most INTJ descriptions emphasize this version of introverted intuiting. So that's cool. Like that works. Analytic NI is this sort of visionary version. It's like sticking to this singular vision of things in the future to improve yourself or to build something, to improve society, whatever it is. And there's a certain like willpower that you can apply to it, and there's a certainty, and it's very compelling. It creates a certain tunnel vision. The person, is not going to like water down their vision. They're not going to let it go. As part of that, the person with NI is going to have realizations, and then the realizations are like recruited as principles to support this vision and like it to make it operate. And it had this idea of like having some like broad realizations that sort of feel and look like principles, and that's a complex concepts. It has that analytical quality to it, and this version tends to be very visual in nature. And there's a certain sense when when it's really strong, that the person has a kind of, they act as sort of a guiding spirit with it. And I don't profess to know the types of any celebrities or anything. I think that that's a very dangerous activity. I have met some celebrities, so I know that they can deliver surprises. But I would say Elon Musk is an example of visionary intuiting, keeping in mind that everybody has all 8 functions in some way, that he really sticks to like the singular vision that even the Tesla cars are all about, can this technology work on Mars? And the solar panels and like having solar storage is like, can this work on Mars? Because that's what it comes down to. And then there's this oracle introverted intuiting. It's like you get into this state and you relax. So it's just like an altered state of consciousness. And it's connecting to and trusting the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious, like whatever your own creative process is, and the archetypal world in general. So there's this openness to it. And it's not open in the sense of like, oh, I work with my creative process in order to fulfill this one vision. Is more like we're open to being transformed by the process itself, that there's a receptive quality to it. And that's something that when we see is like the analytic versions of the functions are always sort of like active, they're focused, they're sort of fixated. And then the holistic versions are like receptive, diffuse, flexible, thus yang and yin. So when we think of NI as like the Greek oracle, or hypnosis, or working with psychedelics, or being a mystic or a poet, and I think this is where we get into Jung's description of NI, because he sort of touches on both, but he emphasizes this yin version. When clearly of the two, Jung had more yin version of NI, regardless of his type, that he talked about as like cultivating an aesthetic experience and a spiritual experience, and floating with all of that. So that would be like one function, sort of the two sides of it. And when it's dominant, hopefully, they work together. So that's like an in-depth of like one function and what it looks like.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You mentioned how you can actually have a blend of two sometimes as well. And so I'm wondering, Dario, if you could cover extroverted thinking next.
Sure. Okay. And just to say that, yes, I think that ideally it's not that people are one or the other. These are not types. This is just flavoring to the person and expression of development. So it's always going to be a blend, and some people will just be more extreme or less blended than others. For extroverted thinking, first of all, extroverted thinking has with it a certain weight or style that automatically people are thinking, oh, it's very analytic. But again, that's not necessarily the case. That we can go back to one is like, how does it show up in different career areas? So there are INTJs and INFJs, across like different career areas for NI. And then for TE, there are ESTJs who are tattoo artists. I know one. There are ISTJs who are musicians. There are, it's not like they're all administrators or engineers or something like that. The same with ENTJ and INTJ. So there actually is this range of things. And we can also look to ask, how much is the TE active, focus, fixed, or yang in style? So this analytic or really yang version is like the manager. So this person is, again, committed to goals, or that usually sub goals that serve like some sort of like overarching goal, like make a lot of money before I'm 30, or build this company within the next 8 years, or 2 years, or whatever it is. And then there are sub goals along with that. This person is the one who gets out there and they speak logically and confidently, and they can weave together stuff on the spot. And I don't mean weave like extroverted intuiting. What I mean is, TJs are often very good if you put them on the spot to explain something, unless it's completely out of their wheelhouse. They're going to be like, oh, yes, wait a minute, there's this and this and this. And then like talk about it very confidently. So there's like a really strong confidence. But I would say what really captures the analytic TE is the business of living. And it's like there's sort of a business mindset. And I mean business in a sort of capitalistic sense, that there's like feedback, and we know we can succeed and we can fail, and we're going to allocate resources, and there are risks and there are benefits, and we're going to weigh those different things. And there's also a seriousness to it. Not serious like, stone face, but there is the sense is like, yeah, the business of living is serious. Like companies can go bankrupt, people can go bankrupt. And so there's this managing and driving others and managing resources to get things done. And I would say the sort of telltales in terms of the different factors and what gets prioritized is speed and profit. And this person in sort of this speed, profit, usefulness, and accuracy. I mean, all of those things are TE things, but the person prioritizes speed and profit. Then we look at the holistic version, and this person is usually going to show up. I mean, the other one can show up as a hard worker too, but this person is more doing the work themselves. And there's a sense of not wealth building, but of frugalness, economy, timeliness, efficiency, especially on a personal level, to sort of have like a TE integrity. And then usually the person is more receptive to doing other people's work, more comfortable with like just a huge mass of details, and logical structures. Like there's like 18 spreadsheets, and there's like 30 different accounting forms, and there's this and there's that. And the person works with templates and fills out the templates. And there's a lot about details and optimizing functionally. And again, that may sound like that's analytic too, but remember maybe the words, because I just chose analytic holistic because those terms are used in neuroscience for like left and right brain. That really we're getting down to yin and yang. And this person is sort of using TE in service of something else. And there's a receptiveness to like, I have this project in front of me. What are the different forms of complexity and which one fits this particular case? And I have these multiple projects available that I'm doing for other people, and then maybe a couple for myself. And I want to get them right. And how do I min-max all of that? But I'm still sort of letting the circumstance drive me. And we might then, well, and as I mentioned with the factors, then this person is prioritizing usefulness and accuracy. And we might think in hearing these, people think like, oh, well, the first one sounds like the ETJs and the second one like the ITJs. No, I mean, the data just doesn't support that. There are versions of both. There is the ESTJ, who is the military general, have met one. And then there is the ESTJ, who is, very happy being a mid-level manager in a large company, and actually doesn't want more responsibility than that, and knows there's a lot of rules and regulations to manage. Doesn't really get to call a lot of shots, but is there to manage a lot. Not in the sense of a manager, but in like building a pyramid. How do you make sure the pyramid gets built properly and maintained properly? And so there's also an element of not just building, but maintaining. And then there are INTJs, for example, who are quite comfortable being this, I want to say like dominant version. So yes, they are directors of companies. Usually not the head honcho, but the director in a company. And they're very comfortable being in this sphere of optimizing the whole organization and pushing that. And then there are other INTJs who are like, yeah, I have like these 3 music albums that I'm working on, and I just want to get all of the details right on those albums. And so there's a very different sense of scope and style to it. I think in this case, for people, especially if they don't have TE, it's a little bit hard to maybe parse them. For me, as someone who does prefer TE, they seem really obviously different to me, because one of them is I'm driving others, and the other is I'm allowing other people or the project or whatever it is to drive me. And that is maybe an essential difference.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one of them is actively, proactively pushing the external world, and the other one is more receptive and flowing with the external world in some sort of way.
Yes.
I oversimplified it, but
That's great. That's great. If we had an ESTP in the room who already understood it, he'd be like, it's this and it's this, and then I'm going to save you 10 minutes of explanation. But I don't have that magic TI ability to just pop it out.
Cool. I think these are really revolutionary findings. And so I am wondering about how FI shows up, introverted feeling, in these 2 styles.
Yeah, this is a favorite function for me, not preferred, but a favorite function. And again, it has an analytic and holistic style. And I call the analytic FI the questor or quester, because they're pursuing a particular like singular life quest or truth. And they're organized around this. So think of like a missionary, for example. And they have this aim, and that they can very much come off of and might even score as a thinking type, because they're applying analytical skills to getting moral clarity, to understanding and like thoroughly sort of looking at their belief system. getting everything congruent. So my actions, my beliefs, my feelings, are they all consistent regardless of what kind of situation I'm in? So this analytic FI person because they're the same person with the same beliefs and expression in every circumstance, pretty much. And they're pursuing the same quest, and they have a consistent personal identity. And hopefully, they're inevitably listening to some kind of conscience. Now, there could be an external reference in some cases, like a holy book or a guru, something like that. But usually it comes back to an internal belief system and a conscience, and they're sort of following that. And you also know this type because the fact is we're messy, organic human beings, and we don't have Platonic moral perfection. So this person has to somehow contain their sin in a way. And so the person is often dealing with that and how to contain their sin. Is a much more black and white kind of function, although it's capable of a lot of analytical complexity. Then the romantic FI is like very existential, and it's a leap. It's every relationship is a leap and is a story, and this is like a life of deep and quiet feeling. There are many voices, there are many feelings that come up every day, multiple times a day. And rather than trying to push those all and to fit and to align, this person is like, I'm just going to sit with all of those. And whatever emerges from that is what emerges, and that is who I am. So there's no decision about who I am. I am the result of all of my FI processes going on. And many times this person has many different sort of soft quests, and they have different identities in different relationships and situations. So in one relationship, oh, that brings out the so-and-so part of me, so I'm going to express that, and it brings out a certain set of feelings. And I start pursuing a goal in this direction. And then, oh, this other relationship actually brings out a completely different part of me. And I'm going to allow room for that. And so there's a room for conflict on the outside, on the inside, and sort of letting that flow. And identity, when you ask them something like, what do you believe? What is your identity? I mean, maybe the best they can do is they'll tell stories. And because there is no like one thing that they could point to, a word. It's sort of diffuse. And it can be wishy-washy, because then the person behaves one way for 2 years in a relationship, and then all of a sudden they move in a different direction. And they're like, no, but now I feel differently. And again, we see this yang and yin versions, and this yang sort of monastic version that recruits the brain's willpower to be like focused and congruent and aligned. And then the holistic version is one that's receptive, that is diffuse and yielding, and is like not one scene, but many different scenes. It's not just an ocean, but many places and many feelings and many relationships, multiple identities that are sort of vague. And the person works on all of them. So that person could make a great novelist, for example, because they can allow every single character to be their own person, including being evil. And this holistic version of FI does not have so much of a problem. They're like, well, what exactly is evil anyway? Whereas the quest or the analytic FI is going to have a much harder time being like, oh, you know what? I can't. If you gave them a short story to write, they really would not want to make the characters do things that were wrong. Or if they do, it's to serve a purpose, like to see, oh, look what happens when you believe this. And sometimes for people who don't prefer FI, it can come up as that quest, or that underneath is very strong, like the ESTJ, who has a very strong religious faith that like never wavers. And then ultimately at the end of the day, besides all the efficient decisions and so on for TE, they're just like, well, everything needs to align. and with this moral compass. And then you have another ESTJ who's like very diplomatic and flowing, and like really, you're like, are they really ESTJ? Like they could be maybe ISTJ, or maybe they're a feeling type. No, is that their FI is just more about a sustained kind of subtle, sophisticated harmony. This person, this ESTJ, would make it like a really good diplomat, for example, because they know how to remain objective and to stand back, and they keep in mind all of the things that they sort of need to do efficiently, functionally. And yet they're like, yeah, every relationship is its own thing. I can be friends with my enemies, and that's, or my nation's enemies. And so that's sort of that's a little bit like that's analytic versus holistic FI.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I think it really helps resolve the paradox of there's this group of FI users who are more likely to identify with having like strong likes or dislikes, or really knowing themselves and being congruent with their knowing. And then there's this other side of FI users who feel very wishy-washy, like they're continuously reinventing themselves and that they have a vague sense of identity. And this is a good way of explaining that. And it's really interesting how you describe holistic FI and how it could appear in an ESTJ. Because it's like, yeah, you'd have a more hippie looking ESTJ and it'd be like, wow, are you really a TE dominant? But they are. It's just they show up so differently than the stereotype. And so I think that that's very mind blowing. And so, Dario, I would love to know your thoughts on extroverted sensing. Can you let us know how those flavors show up?
Sure. This is one of my favorite to talk about. And I think it explains well the difference in sense, extroverted sensing between socionics, which is like the Eastern European version of type, 16 types, and then the MBTI sort of Western American version of extroverted sensing. So in socionics, they describe extroverted sensing as being about force and strength and moving things. And that's what I see it as it is. And so it's this yang version that's like physically active, that's moving others. It has an aggressive style to it. The person is like, oh, there's a problem, just like go and tackle it, like just be present. And for them to be physically present is not even a question. Like that's how they are. They're alert for relevant data. So, sensing is about data, especially concrete, practical data. Extroverted sensing, especially the things that are out there in the environment, whatever is relevant. And they're a little bit more interested in facts than the holistic version, just because facts are a little bit more easily processed by the analytical mind. But relevant data can be absolutely like fun sensory data too, like the taste of different beers or whatnot. They're okay with danger. So yeah, like let's go bungee jumping. Let's jump out of an airplane. Let's go scuba diving where we can pet sharks. Yeah, that's a thing. Let's do this stuff that I was crossing the street one time, like 10 years ago, in Beverly Hills, and there was a cop in the middle of the street, like directing traffic because it was very busy. And I'm with an ISFP, and he just starts jaywalking across the street to the midline, because there's like a little median that has some plants in it where the officer is standing. He actually says hello to the officer and then like continues jaywalking across the street. And I was walking with him and I didn't say anything. And I'm like, only Drew could do that. But that's not true. Like anyone with extroverted sensing with that sort of yang form is going to have this confidence that like just do it and just read the situation and be the alpha, male or female. And they really are focused on action and like what is actionable. What are the bottom line results? And there's this, they can be impressive, they can be strong, they can also be crude because like, oh, there's just the facts of the situation, or rude. I think a great example is Donald Trump. Not that anybody who has SC, they could be more refined, they could have different political beliefs, whatever it is, but I think that's an example. And that is a version that would be particularly offensive to people who have SE as the shadow function, and even what they do have as SE is a yin holistic version. Then they're like, oh, this horrible, like violent, offensive. But it doesn't need to be that way. Like, again, another little story is I was down in Costa Rica, and I'm filming two of my friends as they're doing sparring for Muay Thai and Jiu Jitsu, and they're trying to advertise some of their teaching. And they're quite vigorous. And my one friend in particular, ISFP, is the main teacher. And so this gal comes in, and I think based on the conversation time we spent afterwards, she has INFJ preferences, but I don't know. And she's like, wow, you guys are so like angry and violent. And then they stop and they're like, no, we're not. Like, we don't experience it that way at all. Like, is just expressing ourselves physically. And just in the same way that an intuiting type can do over the top imagination, like ridiculous science fiction or fantasy, or a feeling type can do over the top drama. And so sensing can do over the top action. And then in the case of martial arts, there's a discipline that intersects with it. And that discipline is then what creates an extroverted sensing, the analytic mover that is very mature in its style. So contrast that, and that's more the socionics version as well. And then contrast that with what I think is Isabel Meyer's own like version of SE, even though it was a shadow function for her. To the extent that she had it, it was a yin SE. And it even goes, this is what I call them sensates. And in fact, that's even the word that was used in the Myers-Briggs community here and there. And she would describe extroverted sensing as like, taking in sensory data. I'm like, that's so weak. Like, I mean, my reaction years ago is like, that's so weak. Like, I have SPs, folks with SP preferences in my family, and like, none of them just take in sensory data from the outside world. Like that's like really basic, immature version of what it is. But there's a certain truth to it. And the truth is the sensate version, again, it's about being more receptive. So it's absorbing the sensory experiences. It is the artist that absorbs the experience of the landscape, and then it expresses that through art. It is about enjoying life's pleasures. Notice I didn't say familiar comforts. I said pleasures. Like, yeah, we're gonna go. We will go on a road trip, and then we'll fly around. Maybe we'll go to Thailand for a while and sort of explore there. And it does have some moving, and maybe there's some travel involved, but it really is about absorbing the different sensory experiences. It lets us drink and go to a party and listen to music and smoke some ganja, and then go to art museums and maybe take some classes and learn about like how to do like a little bit of the with Balinese dancing. I haven't been to Thailand, but I've been to Bali. That there's this fun, relaxed feeling to it, and that there are a lot about attending to other people's motion and getting in sync with that. And so that person is not like, see me, I'm going to march up to the top of the hill and I'm going to draw my sword and then run down and lead people into battle. Or just actually maybe not even leading people. They're just running, and they happen through charisma and sheer animal magnetism to be leading people through force. That they're really about like, let's dance together. And so if they've ever done a Burning Man one year, I went to the camp for improvisational contact dance, which is you need to stay physically in touch with your partner at all times, but any part of your bodies, like, elbow and knee or whatever it is, and you need to keep moving to the music, which is not super fast. It's not like electronic dance music. It could be, but is really just about understanding and staying in sync with somebody else physically. Is a very sensual style. So if the analytic sort of yang mover extroverted sensing is, say, sexual, then the sensate yin version is sensual. And those are similar yet different. And there's appreciation of beauty and the grace and artistic and inviting, not like extroverted feeling inviting. They don't even need to do anything. It is just like standing there. There's something about their style and the way that they attend to others at a sensory level that's inviting. They're also the kind of person who's just happy to lie in the sun and get a suntan with the drink at the beach. And that could be, they're an ESFP and that's their idea of fun. And then there's, favorite fun. And then there's some other ESFP who's like, no, let's go jet skiing. And if they don't do the jet skiing, they're going to be really disappointed. And of course, someone with dominant extroverted sensing could really have both of those sides.
Yeah, so the Yang version seems like the more stereotypical adrenaline rushes and thrills and taking those extreme activities or experiences, whereas the more holistic version seems to be a little bit more basking in the experience. And so it doesn't have to be as extreme, but it's still going out and taking in the concrete world for all that the moment can offer.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned this really interesting concept, Dario. You said that your shadow functions can actually have an analytic and holistic side to them too.
Mhm.
And so, wow, we really do have analytic and holistic for all functions. And I'm wondering about extroverted intuition. Could you let me know about that?
Yeah, so this is a sort of favorite dinner topic. It was just staying for a couple of weeks with Antonia Dodge and Joel Mark Witt at it was a personality hacker at their farm in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, and so their ENTP and ENFP preferences. She's the ENTP and he's the ENFP, and they have different versions of extroverted intuiting. And so even though he's the ENFP, he has the analytic version of NE. And even though she's the ENTP, she has the holistic version of extroverted intuiting. And they've talked about this on their podcast, so I'm not, giving away something personal here. What does it look like? So the analytic NE, the Yang NE, is like the person who's pitching Barnum and Bailey circus. Like they're juggling all these different ideas. They're like, there's the quantity of potential possibilities. They're putting on a show. When you listen to them, you're almost like, wow, the story they're telling, is that real? Or did they just make that up? They're recruiting other people. They bring in this like really enthusiastic energy. It's like currents that are like pulling you. And many times, because it's NE, there's this magical quality of like shifting the situation. And then like people in a group or the cast of a show, if the NE person is like a film director or something, all of it just like seems to work through the really this NE that is like out there and interacting and talking, and they like actively court not risk but uncertainty. So risk is like SE, and uncertainty, NE is cool with uncertainty, especially the analytic version. And there is a calculating element to it, and it can feel manipulative or salesman like. And it is that version that feels very out there. And like I've only seen one episode of Better Call Saul, so I probably shouldn't say that, but still, that there's this element, is like the personality is unmistakable, that they have any, and they're out there and they're talking and they're doing stuff. Then there is this catalyst NE, and the best way I can describe that is, I had a student in my lab, and she had the brain imaging cap on, and we were between tasks, and she was quite clear on her ENFP preferences, and she's sitting there just between the tasks, and she's not doing anything that I've given her. She's not keeping herself busy. She just seems to be sitting there, but her brain is like super active. And I'm like, what's going on? Like, what are you thinking about? And she's like, oh, I'm observing those two other students on the other side of the lab there, and I'm imagining like different kinds of interactions they could be having. So this version is more like, what does the world give me? And what patterns am I noticing? And there's like this sort of gentle, quiet, using humor, negotiating towards like this kind of win-win outcome. It's very subtle. It's very subtle. It is the kind of magic that is not, the circus magic. It's the kind of magic that it's like, one of those ENFP romance movies, Amelie or something like that, where it's like, oh, the character, she just smiles, and somehow it's just at the right moment, because the character is actually super attentive to what's going on around them. And they're very good as therapists, for example. They don't even need to say a lot. And they're just like, oh, da, 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 and da, da, da. Oh, and then they ask a question, or they hear sort of like, or they just throw out something and they hear sort of the words you give back, and they notice your voice tone, like sort of highlight certain words over others, and they're sort of pinging you and or the whole situation, and they're building up sort of a picture of it. And then they're like, oh, and then we can remove this block from the Jenga tower, and wow, it still stands, and I have this block that's made of gold. And so that there really is this using humor, using disguise. There's an inclusiveness. There's promoting others, and rather than entertaining a lot of different potential possibilities and throwing those against the wall and seeing what sticks, they're more about quality, because Yin is always more about quality, and they're more like, how can I nurture the best quality of this potential possibility, and not like trying to force the magical moments or actively create them, but to be attentive to when they can really manifest on their own, and then doing that little thing, boop, that like even draw someone attention, and everyone's like, wow. So that's, I'm describing in a very positive way, both of them. They have negative sides too. But that is one can be fairly manipulative, and one can be quite overwhelming and pushy. But this is, that's true of all of them, all of the functions. But there is like that little bit of NE differences.
Got it. So within NE, there can be such different flavors of it. And so is Joel Markowitz more of the analytical or the holistic? Wait, analytical, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I wonder,
So he is the ENFP is more analytic, and she is the ENTP is the more holistic one.
Yeah.
To really highlight that these are not about thinking and feeling, for example. It's not like the NFPs are the quiet catalysts and the NTPs are the wild marketers. Once you know enough people of the same type, you're like, oh no, there's a lot of variety.
Absolutely. And so I was wondering about, if an ENFP has analytical, extroverted intuition, does it make them look a little bit more ENFJ-like by accident? Like, could people accidentally go like, that NE looks like NI because it's an analytical, more serious version?
Yeah, that person that ENFP could look more like an ENFJ or an ENTP, a type that's sort of right adjacent. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. These categories, like, you can be any type, but be a certain kind of analytical or holistic version of a function. However, it seems like if you have a version of a function that people don't associate in their heads with a certain type, they might think that you're an adjacent type, even though you're actually your type. And so this is where mistyping can happen, because we have an idea of how a person is like. And so, yeah, that's why I really like your theory here. It really adds a lot of nuance. And so I'm wondering if we can go into introverted thinking.
Yeah. So this is I find this one really fascinating as well. I remember sitting at a lunch table, maybe in 1996, with David Kiersey, who wrote "Please Understand Me" with Marilyn Bates. So David Kiersey was there, and Linda Behrens was also there, and they both have INTP preferences. And David Kiersey is clearly the analytic ideologue TI, can't miss it. And Linda Behrens is definitely the systemist, like Yin, holistic version of TI. And it's funny because David Kiersey espouses a philosophy around personality that is a holistic philosophy, but he himself is not. I mean, that's, you know, I mean, at least that, having lunch with him, that was my only time that I met him. But there definitely was this difference. We've seen it. I mean, we've all seen the differences between these two. So I call the analytic TI the ideologue. They are just very, very stubborn on principles. There is this like singular, most worthy framework that explains everything, at least within this domain. They really seek to define everything precisely. They're going to provide sort of expert guidance and logic. They bring order to ideas. So whenever you present something, boom, they're going to take their one favorite supermodel and just like, this is the way it is. And they're very big in their behavior in terms of like correcting errors, their own errors and other people's errors, poor thinking, wrong approaches. In an immature form, it can be really obnoxious. And the framework is actually unconscious to the person, even if it's their dominant function. But generally speaking, it also comes with the strength that this is the person can step forward and be like, I truly am an expert in this area here, like computer systems architecture or something like that. Or they work with CEOs and politicians, and they're very comfortable where their framework is not a framework for something technological or about individual people in psychology. It's a framework of power itself and how you move the levers of power. And this person presents this like really strong appearance and stubbornness. Then you have, and they are more likely, in my experience, to want to take their model and extend it inappropriately, especially when they're younger. So they're like, they have a PhD in physics, which somehow, for some reason, makes them an expert on everything, because everything is related to physics in some way. But when they get older, or when they're more mature, really, I should say, is that they have awareness of like, this is my domain, and I'm like really, really good in this, and then they're more chill in their other areas. Systemist TI takes this holistic approach. They're the ones that talk about taking different points of view. They're the ones that talk about perspective shifting, about finding patterns in chaos. So it's not like I'm taking a model and I'm imposing it on the world. That they notice this interaction going on around them, and they're like, notice this and notice this, and you know, this seems like a significant factor, and we can sort of pull that out, and then here's like a couple of models I'm going to bring in to sort of begin to narrow down where it is. And then, oh wow, there's this other data I never even considered, like let me set that aside for a moment and start working with this other stuff. They very much notice qualities then in a holistic way, like how something scales. So in the social sciences, for example, there's family systems, there's the individual psychological system, there are tribe and nation systems, and they're ones that are comfortable having multiple models around those, and also seeing how they're all interconnected without trying to force it into one thing. And the way they apply the principles tends to be more fluid, that there's a more relaxed approach. They don't go around, you know, they usually are the TI folks who do not come off as insulting. I mean, they might accidentally, of course, at times. I mean, we all can, those with the thinking preference in general, but and feeling folks too. But there's this, people are technology, nature, everything is connected to everything else. And there is a certain, like, when they're mature, a humbleness that comes, that they enjoy analyzing and exploring that and seeing how they all interrelate, but they also acknowledge the messiness of life. Now when they're not mature, then this version is just like really scattered, no clear principles or frameworks. They're very they just move, and they're pushed. They allow themselves to be pushed in whatever direction the river of life is taking them. They use models that are like presented by society without really maybe looking at those critically. And that could be like an immature version that's just like receiving those without really like having, because you do need to have both. There does need to, even when I say like a systems approach, the systems approach is in fact the ideologue saying like, hey, there's this overarching framework, and then that overarching framework allows for a tremendous amount of holistic thinking, and then that's great. And that's an example of how you can have the two sides, or the two styles work with each other to be integrated.
Well said, Dario. And so it seems like even our flavors of our cognitive functions can have one-sidedness. And so the key is also integration between these two styles as well. And so, Dario, I'm wondering about your explanations around extroverted feeling and how it presents itself in the two flavors.
Mm. I feel that particularly this distinction is important for extroverted feeling, because extroverted feeling is portrayed one way often, especially in traditional type literature. And then the people I encounter half the time, even though they clearly have FJ preferences, don't really behave according to the descriptions, or their energy isn't like that. So again, it's sort of like, what's going on? So there's this active, focused, fixed analytic version of FE, Yang FE, the shepherd. And they're the person that is, especially if it's the dominant function, is radiating an aura or field of their needs and values, or society's needs and values as they see them. And they announce those, if they will voice those given the opportunity, and they will prescribe their values to situations. And when they notice people who are not going with the vibe, the value, they will do their best to corral those outliers and to encourage them to join the group. And so and when they see problems in a relationship, they are less accommodating. I mean, they're going to say in the language of FE, "Oh, I want us to, have a chance to sit down and talk with each other." But what they really mean is that I want to actively fix the relationship. So I'll try and find a win-win result. But the fact is that I have certain values around relationships, and you need to understand what those are, and I'm going to communicate those. They can be very inspiring as orators, as shepherds in any kind of environment. So in an organization, if they're in tune with the values of the organization, to help everyone be aware of those and to get in sync as best they can with those values. If they're like a pastor of a church, then it's even much more obvious how that would be. They can be, and they can be the kind of person. I mean, I think all of the Yang functions are capable. That person is capable of being sort of a cult leader, but this person could be an example of it. That they're inspiring, that they're corralling, they're shepherding. They are willing to make sacrifices, by the way. Like, they can make very big sacrifices, and they ask others to sacrifice. And it's a kind of thing that's not just the Yin version, which is like friendly and the host, and the person goes around like very empathic and feeling what other people are feeling, and then at the end of the day they're like, why didn't I get my needs met? This version of FE, more like the people around them are like, what is this? Either in a very positive way or in like a really sort of shocked way. Maybe the black sheep doesn't want to be corralled into the pen with the other sheep. So that's then a measure of the maturity of that person with that. I think social justice is a great example. The ESFJs and ENFJs, just FJs in general, like, they're usually going to have that shepherd FE that is going to be getting people in line with the language and the behavior and the values and so on. And then there's this host Yin version, which actually has very mature form, not just like this weak sort of like going with the flow of whatever people want. That they're really about enjoying their friendships and their relationships and nurturing those, their community, their family, their friends, their coworkers. They value harmony over being right. And I think this is really a big difference between the Yang and Yin versions, is that the Yang version of FE values being right, in terms of their values and feelings and needs. Even if they feel like, oh, I have the wrong feeling, I need to feel differently, it's still about feeling right. Whereas the FE is more like just wanting to be in harmony with other people, and they don't presume that they know how that is going to happen. In fact, in different relationships, they know they can be harmonious in different ways. So this is another telltale, is that one FJ is the same in every situation, pretty much, in terms of the values that they express. Like, it's clear all the time, the needs that they have, the way they communicate. Whereas the Yin version of FE knows that, like, oh, like, my granddaughter has these needs, and I'm going to relate to her this way. And that this other person in my life, like my neighbor or my boss, like, they have different values from me, and that's okay. Like, how can we live harmoniously even though we're all different? And this version is very sensitive, in my experience, whereas the Yang version is more hardened. The Yin version is much more, the holistic version, much more sensitive to negative feedback, and sensitive to positive feedback as well. Like, all those little nuances, like, especially for SFJs, that, like, somebody can say something to them and there's like 5 different ways that could be taken. And is that like an underhanded compliment? Is that a genuine compliment? Is it supposed to be a joke? Like, did they remember, like, this little detail about my life that I would be sensitive to this thing that they just said, even though other people normally wouldn't be? So they have, like, this high sensitivity to them. And like the analytic FE, they can also be self-sacrificing, but it tends to be in many small ways rather than in one big way. And it's like all the little sacrifices they make every day, as a coworker, as a friend, as a parent, as a spouse. And so and I call that one the host, or, hostess, because they're holding space, and they're hosting space. And when you say holding space, can also mean you don't do very much. Hosting means it's much more active. So I want to say, like, they're hosting a space. Whereas the other one clearly is like managing the sheep and is a shepherd.
And so you have a more assertive FE that has a right way of everyone FEing in the environment. It seems a little bit imposing. And then you have the more passive FE, or the more accepting FE. It's the more stereotypical FE. And so, yeah, I like how your definitions, they make way for, here's why less stereotypical versions of a type exists. And so I like how your approach doesn't invalidate anyone else's. So it's like everyone is right to a certain degree. It's just they're describing the more holistic version or the more analytical version. And so that people stop fighting, and that they can integrate their approach into a singular way of seeing it. So it's very smart, Dario. And so I'm wondering about your definition of introverted sensing in the 2 styles.
Boy, we've done almost all the functions now. Very nice. Last but not least, one of the most common functions. I think it's particularly important to talk about these 2 sides of SI, because the SJ folks out there, the many tens of millions in America, not to mention the probably 1 billion around the world, like, they really get described often in type in a very sort of stereotypical way. Or when it's more extroverted type, like ESTJ or ESFJ, we just tend to emphasize the dominant function and sort of miss the auxiliary. And so let's talk about those. One of them is this Yang version of SI I describe as like a defender, as an anchor, as a guard. as a protector, that they have a very firm sense of culture and history and can talk about it and take pride in it and see it as something very important. It's not just that they're the anchor, it's that, as my grandmother, ESTJ preferences, would describe, it's like at any moment society can descend back into barbarism because of the very nature of human beings, not just like overnight, but she's like, there are all of these institutions which took centuries to build that tame who we are, like our word, the worst side of our natures. And she was very clear about what the strengths are and what the weaknesses are and what's important from culture and history and what to stick to. And there's, with this version, there are these impressions, and usually from their upbringing, but it could be somewhere else along the way if it was impactful later, that are like, these are the really strong impressions. And those are the things that we're going to guard and protect and rely upon. They're like the pillars in the Acropolis. And some of them may crumble, but still we can hold firm even to what the image of the Acropolis is and what it stood for in its golden age. The democracy and education and philosophy and all of those things. They're really, if you look at what's going on with that person, their sort of not so hidden agenda is that they're aiming to civilize, to be civil. That doesn't mean touchy-feely. That doesn't mean nice. That doesn't even mean efficient. It just means civil. And they're not necessarily hysterical about safety or whatnot. Like, they know, oh, there's times when you need to go to war. Let's do that smartly. But for the most part, they do prefer familiarity and convenience, and they are going to block big changes. They do tend to be traditional. Again, it's around this organizing sense that's deep within them, this very firm sense of history and culture. And just like the value of that, all the impressions associated around it are very strong. And I think it's important to remember, when I say impressions, I'm talking about how Jung described introverted sensing, and I really need to backtrack to this. So people argue about, how do you define introverted sensing? I'm like, just go read the damn book. Like, go back to psychological types, and Jung talks very clearly in one section about it. And it's very much about building up a giant database of sensory impressions. And those impressions can easily override the actual tangible experience in front of them. So it's like the person who had a bad experience with sushi will forever experience sushi in that way, regardless of how it tastes or what situation they're in, or if it's a new place or whatever it is. There's this like overriding sense that happens. So just talk about SI in general there for a moment. And then there's this other version of SI, which is, it's not that it's anchored in anything particular. It just comes off as very grounded. There's home and there's work and there's community and there are traditions. And then there's this enormous database of memories. And it's not just a select few that are the pillars. It's like the entire vista, the entire museum of everything that's from their life. And that gives them a very grounded feel to them, especially because there's no one thing you can ever point to. It's not like, oh, we can pull this leg out from under the chair and then the chair is not going to stand. I mean, they're not going to like that, but it's like they're just like, no, that chair has 1,000 legs. They're the kind of SI that's more adaptable to changes and to flexing, because there is this receptive yin quality to it. And because they have this very strong grounding of all of these memories, they're just like, yeah, like, let's add a few more. Okay, so the style is completely different, and now people wear black lipstick, or they wear funny shoes, or we're all supposed to wear a mask. That's just one more thing that goes into the database, the sensory database. I mean, of course, they prefer things to be safe and comfortable and familiar. And they are very sensitive to these subtle sensory variations. Just because the database is so big, things are not just pushed into this, like, is it this pillar or this pillar, or is it the barbarians? Which is more the Yang version of SI. It's much more like, there's 64 million colors, and every color is a little bit different, and every color or pattern of colors evokes something different. And they're very comfortable sort of then flowing with the culture and where the culture changes. At least in practice, they may complain along the way if things are too abrupt and too different, but nonetheless, there is this groundedness that is just like you can't take away from them. And so they're more like the rock rather than the defender, or they're more like, I want to say, the hearth. And that's the word that I use. They are the hearth is what warms the home. And that's and they're sort of like, they can be the hearth almost everywhere they go, as long as it's within their range of experience.
SI is both the anchor and the home for people. Oh, that's such a wholesome definition. And so thank you for describing the holistic and analytical versions of each of the cognitive functions. It really allows people to see the 3 or 4 dimensionality of your cognition. And so you really are able to integrate all the different definitions. I really enjoy this approach where you're able to see people as systems. And so you don't reduce people down to a single part of them, but you really try to figure out ways to describe their complexity in the most honest way. And I think that allows a lot of people to be able to see themselves in a more accurate way, and that they don't have to feel confined to any sort of one way that people view a certain function. And so, yeah, I think that this contribution to type is really magnificent. And I think that it provides people a lot of food for thought. So when they see a new person and they may not fit their prototypical version of what they have in their mind of that type, they can remember, oh, Dario actually sees these kind of sides to the functions. And so it allows people to be more open-minded. This is a tool that increases open-mindedness. And so thank you, Dario, for your wonderful revolutions in type. He is the author of the books The Magic Diamond and The Neuroscience of Personality, which I'll link below, and many others too. And thank you for all the work that you do here and all the enrichment you give to the type space.
Absolutely, it was my pleasure. And yeah, I really appreciate coming on, and appreciate you. And yeah, just leading everybody through these and bringing it to so many people. And yeah, thank you so much.
As you say, you help people triangulate their self-knowledge in a dark forest. So you provide that light that helps them navigate throughout their type journey.
I love that. Thank you for providing that metaphor. It's yeah, I mean, I have to give some credit to I learned that in grad school in engineering, because it's originally a math engineering concept, and to Linda Barron's. But that finding our way in a dark forest is that there are times in a relationship or in our lives or in our career path, whatever it is, we can feel that way. And if it just means a person looking at their preferred functions and thinking, gee, I can actually work on my preferred functions because one of them maybe is really one-sided. That may be why that person is in the dark forest, is because they're really overdoing the Yang version, and or the Yin version. And it's like, yeah, there's a whole other side for you, and it's your preferred function even. So go to it. And I believe that a lot of it is about opportunity. So we do need to place ourselves in a different situation. And if a person is stuck in a particular workplace or at home, or the school, whatever, is not allowing them the opportunity to express that other side of a function, maybe it's time to actually change the situation and allow it. So it's like the TJ person is not going to have a chance to be that Jeff Bezos kind of leader unless they actually, even if they start as the king of their garage, or queen of their garage. Like, you have to start somewhere with it, as opposed to being under somebody else's thumb or being an accountant or whatever it is that takes you in the other direction of TE. And so I encourage people, if they look at these or think about them and they're like, wow, I could grow my dominant function. I'm like, you go and find stuff and explore stuff that actually like waters that other side of you and that allows it to come out.
Yeah, that's a really good lesson, because at the end of the day, what type teaches us is one of the ways that we can conquer one-sidedness, or that we can address our one-sidedness. And so, yeah, what are the parts of you that you need to grow to become a more well-rounded person? And so thanks, Dario Nardi, for coming out and giving us your wonderful, blessed insights. And he's going to be speaking at the November fall conference for the APTI. So stay tuned for that. And thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you all in the next episode. Take care.
Thank you.